Now, one thing that's important to understand is who is approving access to any type of resource. Unfortunately, in some environments, it's up to IT. They're setting up the accounts, they're assigning the privileges and the permissions, and that's not how it should be, because they don't have that liability. It should be somebody at a higher level that actually assigns access. And we're going to get more into that in identity management in Domain 2. But right now, what I want to get across is there's data owners who will set the classification. By them setting the classification, that indicates who can access this data. It's not IT's job or anybody else's job to say who can access this data. It's the data owner. They're responsible for not what it means to set the classification. It means who can actually access this. Now we're going to get into information classification. In a lot of environments that I've worked in, they've had information classification policies, but there was that was it, just a policy. So if you're actually going to implement information classification, you really need to set up a program. And this isn't as easy as it may sound if you haven't been through it, because data is everywhere. You know, you have to go through and figure out what is sensitive, what classification level does it need to be at, who should access it, where does the data reside, where does it go through the actual network. So you have to have your goals mapped out, and it has to map to your business needs, of course. So one of the biggest things that's happening in the industry today is data leakage, and that directly has affiliated with information classification, because a lot of companies just have an information classification policy and that's it. They don't know how to set up a structured system. They don't necessarily know how to enforce classification levels. They don't have the structure to actually do it. So because of that, and because they don't have tight access control, sensitive data is leaving. It's going through emails, employees are collecting it, people are losing laptops, and constantly getting in the headlines. So the loss of sensitive data actually happens so much, it doesn't really make the headlines anymore. I know recently somebody, actually in my family, said, "Oh, did you hear about whatever company lost, 300,000 Social Security numbers?" And I didn't know, but what they didn't realize is it happens like every day. It happens all the time. We don't necessarily know about it, but companies are losing sensitive data left and right, and it's not unless it gets to the news do we find out about it. And some companies are losing data and they don't even know it. They've been giving the hackers Social Security numbers, sensitive information for years, and nobody's recognized it yet. So in your classification program, you have to set up levels. Now, in the military and the government, there's very strict levels that are already set up: top secret, secret, confidential. Now, in the commercial sector or the corporate world, it's up to the organization to set up what you're going to use. And you can use whatever you want to use, and you define its definition. So there's no standard that says confidential means this or sensitive means that. The company has to come up with what classifications they're going to use and what that means. It means what sensitive data would fall under confidential, what type of sensitive data will go under private. So of course it makes sense that the more sensitive the data, the higher the level of the classification, the more controls and monitoring and auditing that needs to take place. So there's a relationship between the classification levels and the trust that's put together. So why don't we just call everything top secret, then it's all protected, and call it a day? Because it's expensive. Something that's higher classification requires more controls, more man hours, more monitoring, more auditing. So it's expensive. It takes more revenue and time to protect things at a higher level. So that's why you have to have this structured approach so you're efficient, your cost, there's a cost benefit there. So how do we do this? Well, we first need to figure out what are we protecting, just like before when we were talking about the risk management. What information assets are we going to protect? Because not all information has to be protected. Not all information is sensitive. We need to define the levels that we're going to use. Maybe we're going to use classified, private, and public. We have to define those. Then we define a criteria that we're going to look a little bit more into. But how do you actually classify data? Because you don't want people to just wing it. You actually have a criteria to determine what goes into private, what goes into public. So then you come up with your handling and labeling procedures, which means how does this information get moved around, who can move it, and it needs to be labeled. And this is another way where information is being lost. You know, backup tapes disappear, and companies will actually sell off their systems, and they haven't wiped their hard drives, and it still has sensitive data there. So then you need to define who the owners are, who's responsible for the different data sets, and then you come up with the level of protection that's required per classification. So if you have confidential, it requires this level of protection. If you have private, it requires this level of protection. And you need to integrate it into your security awareness training and any other training programs, because users need to know what to do or how to deal with this type of information. You know, if something's marked confidential, who can have it, who can't have it, how am I supposed to move it around? So you have to inform the people who will be working with the data. So the first thing you do is develop a policy. Policy is at a high level, and it's going to lay out a lot of the things that we just talked about. The data owner, what the data owner's responsibility is, what the classifications that are going to be used, what the definition is per classification. So you have a policy that outlines everything that's been decided upon. And then you have to have your procedures and guidelines and standards. So we have to spell out, how do we classify information? How do we change the classification? Because sometimes things can be declassified, or sometimes it becomes more sensitive. How do we destroy the data? And another domain, we're going to talk about how to securely destroy sensitive data. But these are all the things that have to be considered. And that's why it sounds like data classification is an easy process, but there's actually a lot involved. So on the classification levels, it's important to not have too many of them. Say you had 15 classification levels. Well, that's too crazy. It's too confusing. Nobody would know what to put, you know, what kind of data goes where. So you don't want too many, but you also don't want too small of an amount, because they're not going to be taken seriously. So, you know, a lot of companies actually have 3. It's very common for corporations to have 3 classification levels. It's important that they're very distinct, so there's no confusion on the type of data that goes under that classification. So those classification levels should not overlap. So I talked about a criteria, and this is something that I've seen a lot of companies miss. You know, they'll have a policy. They may even identify the data owners, who's responsible for the data, but the data owners have no idea how to classify the information. They just gut, you know, that seems sensitive, so I'll put it into this classification. Or I think people could have access to that, so I'll put it in public. That's not a standardized approach. And most people who are going to be data owners are business people, and they haven't done this before. So if you're going to have a standardized approach across the whole enterprise, so that the data owners are classifying the data the same way, you have to have a criteria. And the criteria lays out examples of what would go into the different classifications. and it would describe the business impact. You have to understand the business impact of if this data got corrupted or if somebody got a hold of it, and if it causes a bigger impact to the business, of course it's going to be more sensitive. So this is a very simplistic example of a criteria. It shows the different regulations and what the regulations call out as sensitive information. Now, you don't really have to come up with a spreadsheet because there's a lot of tools that lay this stuff out for you. There's automated tools that have everything under HIPAA, what's considered sensitive, everything under GLB, what's considered sensitive. But you have to have something laid out so that data owners know how to map them. So as an organization, you could choose to put in an information classification program or not. And what I find very interesting in the industry as a consultant is that companies really want to control the data leakage where sensitive data is leaving their environment, but they don't want to set up a security information program because they don't see the connection. If you're going to control your sensitive information, you have to set up an information classification program. That's necessary to identify the data, identify the controls that have to be in place to protect it, identify roles and responsibilities. Now, I talked about the information owner or the data owner and said that it's their responsibility to classify the data. What's also important is they actually know that they're a data owner. I've been in companies where they have assigned data owners and the data owners didn't even know it. So there's no way that they would ever be able to carry out their tasks. Now, they also need to understand how to do this process. You have to train the data owners on how to use the criteria, understand the business impact of different types of sensitive data and put it into the classification. So you can't just on paper say somebody's a data owner and that's it. It's just paper. So as I said before, the sensitive data must be labeled properly and have handling procedures. How are we supposed to handle this? If it's a digital, if it's in paper, who is supposed to handle it? What are the procedures? There should be markings. If it's classified, it should have that on the actual paper or on the digital format. And this is important that, it gets back to that whole do care thing. If sensitive information got out and then one of your customers came to sue you, you'll go to court and they'll say, well, what did you do? And if you didn't do things like this, if you didn't set up an information classification program, if you didn't train the people how to do it, you didn't properly mark what was sensitive and what wasn't, then you'll be found liable and you'll be in the headlines, which is not a good thing. So you need to test your classification program. Make sure that the people know what they're supposed to be doing. Do they have the sensitive data out so everybody can view it? Do they talk about it over the telephone? Do they email it? Do they put it on their USB, jump drives? So you need to actually follow up and not assume that you can come up with a policy, come up with a program, and then it's all going to work fine. So how do you actually test them? And I tell companies it's good to actually put this type of stuff in your internal auditing procedures. So this is something else they're looking at.